All right. So, do you want to just kick off by introducing yourself? And for anyone that might be interested in your job as a future career, do you want to just describe what it is that you do and what your day to day looks like?
Great. Yeah, I'm a media and campaigns officer at Positive Money. So basically, that involves press work, so writing press releases, putting out comments in response to breaking news, prepping our spokespeople for briefings and interviews, liaising with journalists and things like that. But then there's also a content creation aspect to my job. So I make videos and I make blogs, and I look after a lot of our social media output too. So there's obviously been a lot to respond to this week with lots of Liz Truss's policies being floated in the media. So it's been a busy week or two. And the mini budget is out today, so we'll have lots to say about that.
Yes, my God, it's been quite a few weeks, hasn't it? And some really interesting kind of policies being announced or talked about in the news. Um, we'll get onto all of that stuff as we go along. But can you just talk more about what Positive Money is about? What kind of campaigns are you working on? What's your mission?
Yeah, so we were set up post-crash to reimagine the economy as one that works for people and the planet rather than a handful of wealthy elites and bankers. So we work across four key areas. One of those is democratizing money and banking. So basically, we think that money should be a tool that works in the public interest, and doesn't concentrate power in small bubbles or reinforce structures of oppression. So we need a diverse banking system which serves different needs, be that communities' access to banking and finance services, investing in a green transition, or reducing inequality. The second area we work in is creating a Green Bank of England. So basically trying to raise awareness that the Bank of England is a regulator of all of the UK's commercial banks. So as such, it has the power to basically steer money away from fossil fuels, make lending to those more expensive, and make lending to green, clean energies cheaper. And then once we raise awareness of that, we then move on to campaigning for that. And then one of the third thing we do is working on this idea of a well-being economy. So basically the idea here is that we need to move away from GDP and growth and the stock market booming as measures of how well we're doing as a society. Because even if these things are growing, that wealth isn't distributed equally. So it doesn't materially improve the lives of most people if GDP keeps going up. So we need to use different metrics that affect everyone, like healthcare, education, housing, environmental health, to see how well everyone's really doing. And then the fourth area is new economy thinking. So this is basically the idea that mainstream economics, it doesn't equip us to deal with the crises of today. So be it climate change, soaring inequality, pandemics, the energy crisis, it doesn't provide us with solutions to those things. So what we need is a more pluralist approach that brings in perspectives on racial justice, on feminism, on the environment, which have been traditionally excluded from mainstream economics.
Gosh, it's no small task. There's a lot
No.
going on there. And, really brilliant stuff. You're really speaking my language in terms of trying to make the economy fairer and to make it work, not just for society, but for the environment as well. But is this just a poor people's campaign? Does anyone else care about equality and fairness and stability? You would hope so, but there doesn't seem to be much action from the top to redesign how things are done so far.
Yeah, well, I think we have influential supporters of our campaigns. A number of MPs and peers, with political influence, appear on our panels at events like report launches or party conferences. We'll be at the Labour and Conservative Party conferences this year with MPs from both parties on our panels discussing the future of finance in the UK and how it can work for everyone. And many of them share our work and the work of other organisations in our space, be that on social media or even on the floor in Parliament, in hearings, in debates, in committee sessions. So I think there are a lot of MPs that want to do more for people. Obviously, there are some politicians who might not personally care about the well-being of most people. But if these issues are impacting their constituents who elect them, then they have to care. I think that's why it's so important to make our collective voice heard and show that we do care about these issues.
Yeah. And you also mentioned GDP there. So to my mind, all problems lead back to that. You know, it's this faulty metric. Can you explain what GDP actually is and why it's a problem, and if we have any hope of a fairer society until we change it?
Yeah, so GDP, gross domestic product, is effectively the growth of our economy. There has been steady but small growth of the UK economy over the last few years. But as Clive Lewis said in Parliament yesterday, if GDP growth equals a better society, then why aren't most people better off? Why haven't most people seen their living standards improve over the last few years? And I think the reason is that even though the economic pie is getting bigger, most people aren't getting a bigger slice of that pie. And I think particularly troubling is when we're talking about growing the financial sector, which is something Liz Truss is adamant that she's going to do. There's been a proposed amendment to the Financial Services and Markets Bill, which basically shapes how our financial services sector is going to look post-Brexit. And they're trying to bring in an objective for regulators to consider the international competitiveness of the firms they regulate when they're setting and enforcing the rules. And obviously, that means they can't effectively regulate those firms if they're having to consider whether sanctions or fines against them or new rules to stop them, misbehaving, essentially, will affect their competitiveness globally. It's essentially just a race to the bottom on who can have the lowest bar for rules to attract overseas investment. But the problem with that is we end up attracting even more dirty money, and we're already a haven for dirty money in the UK. And this even actually poses a national security risk, because obviously if we're attracting lots of money from oligarchs, then they have a sway on our political system and our democracy. It also just flies in the face of levelling up. This government's been talking a lot about levelling up the UK, distributing wealth amongst different regions, but all this does, growing the financial sector, is further concentrate money in the City of London. So there's also a clear contradiction between net zero goals and environmental goals and growing the financial sector, because if we're just pouring money into the financial sector invests that in what's profitable, and that at the moment is fossil fuels. So there's a clear contradiction there as well. And also, it doesn't necessarily work. In our recent lobbying report, we cite studies from the University of Sheffield and from the IMF, where they actually show that at a certain point, unconstrained growth of the financial sector is bad for the rest of the economy. It starts to take away from the rest of the economy rather than give to it. So yeah, lots of different reasons why GDP growth is not a great thing for most people in this country.
Yeah, and something that I want to add to that as well is that we have a target to reach net zero emissions by 2050. It's embedded into UK law, and yet this new bill that you're talking about, that is, giving regulators the job of making sure that financial services grow and are internationally competitive. It has admitted to give them an objective that would consider our kind of a net zero target, and our desperate need to reduce emissions if we're going to, avoid more environmental catastrophes and nature loss and all of those things that are really unsettling the planet. So that's another objective that I would like to see them consider.
Yes, we're part of a group called Finance for Our Future. It's sort of a coalition of organisations, and we're basically asking exactly for that, for them to have to consider net zero rather than consider growth of the financial sector, consider net zero and reaching that goal and being aligned with the Paris Agreement, that should be something they're having to focus on rather than GDP growth.
Yeah, exactly. And, it can be compatible in many cases. There's a debate around whether we need green growth or whether degrowth is the answer if we want to protect people and planet. But green growth is possible. We can invest in green technologies to help us meet those net zero targets and align ourselves with the Paris Agreement. So yeah, there's lots of ways that we can still be, still experience prosperity, but also do well for the environment and people. So I'm a fan of, go on, sorry.
I think we also have to be honest that, at the start, it won't be more profitable to go green. There will be upfront costs to the transition, but that doesn't mean it's not worth it. And actually the cost of doing nothing will be much greater, which we can talk about later. But essentially, it is important to be honest that there will be costs, and it won't be, for banks, it won't be the most profitable thing to invest in clean and green rather than dirty, because fossil fuels are just cheaper at the moment. But that doesn't mean it's not worth doing. And also, we can see an explosion in jobs in this sector in clean energies. And there was recent news that for the first time, there are now more jobs in clean energy than there are in dirty, which is such a great move towards the future of this.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an important point. I think it's that there is this upfront cost, but over the long term, we're all going to do better if we do invest in it now. So moving on to the next question, and just talking about the wealth gap. You mentioned that being a serious issue. I think it's such a serious issue that I think insurers actually sent a risk warning to their clients to say that there's an increased risk of civil unrest because of the cost of living and the effects of the pandemic and all of those types of things. So people are really feeling the pinch in a big way, and businesses are being warned that it could lead to damage to property. Civil unrest is a real thing. There's somebody that I find quite interesting as a kind of a messenger around the wealth gap, the inequality economist Gary Stevenson, and he's campaigning for a bigger wealth tax. What do you think about that? And do you think it's fair to tax the wealthy, or is that going to cause even more fractures in society?
I think that ultimately, yes, it is fair to tax those with vast amounts of disposable income more than we tax those who are struggling to heat their homes and feed their families right now. I think Gary Stevenson is an interesting example because he's someone who did make lots of money in the financial services sector and then turned around and said, you know what, this isn't fair. And there are groups like Patriotic Millionaires who are very wealthy people who are saying, hey, we need to be taxed more. This isn't fair. So there is even support for amongst those groups as well. And there were, during the pandemic, there were large numbers of famous, I think, millionaires and billionaires signing open letters saying, tax us more. But I think specifically we should be taxing unearned wealth, like that gained via ownership of multiple properties. So basically we could have taxes increasing for every home that you own to dampen demand for, multiple home ownership and allow first-time buyers onto the property ladder rather than all the homes getting snapped up by people who already own homes. And I think it's also important when we're talking about taxing the wealthy that we're not always talking about individuals, but we're talking about companies too, with a bit of extra taxation on banks, on energy companies who are making windfall profits, record profits right now. We could basically lift millions of people out of poverty, and it just means slimming down their profit margins a bit. You know, they're not going to become unprofitable a lot of the time. They just won't be as profitable. And that there have been arguments against this, basically saying that if you tax energy companies too much, they won't reinvest. But lots of research has shown that actually where they invest their money is into share buybacks and into paying dividends to shareholders. So it's not going back to reinvestment in public services at all. And another argument against it was companies claiming that it would damage pension funds in the UK because of their investments in oil and gas. Well, research from Commonwealth earlier this year found that 0.2% of Britain's main pension funds was invested in Shell and BP. So it's a tiny percentage of that portfolio. So basically, there's no reason we shouldn't be taxing them more.
Yeah, can you explain why it is that banks and energy companies are making these like booming profits right now, yet we're all struggling? What's happened there?
So it started with, linking it to inflation. Inflation obviously started getting bad during the pandemic, where there were supply chain disruptions. And so there was a demand and supply issue where there was still the same amount of demand, but not enough supply. But that's not so much what we're seeing anymore. What we're seeing since the invasion of Ukraine is a gas crisis where the international cost of gas has gone through the roof. So basically, energy companies have made windfall profits, unexpected profits from that boom. And we're all paying the price for it, which is just another reason we need to get off of fossil fuels. A lot of politicians at the moment are arguing that we could have gas from the UK and that would help the crisis. Well, firstly, just drilling it in the UK doesn't mean it would bring down the cost internationally. We wouldn't produce enough as a nation to bring down the international cost. Secondly, that oil and gas would be owned by the companies drilling it, not the UK government. So it's not like they would give it to us for a discount. You know, it would still cost the same amount. And thirdly, it's obviously really bad for the environment, not in line with our net zero goals, and bad for people's health. This new idea of lifting the ban on fracking is a terrible idea, and it's still got massive earthquake risk in the UK. It's still massively unpopular. Lord Debon, who heads up the Climate Change Committee in the UK, has said that it won't bring prices down. You've got Quadrilla, the fracking giant in the UK, saying that the UK isn't suitable for fracking. So basically, we just need to get off gas. And the best way to do that is to invest in retrofitting of our homes so that we don't need as much of it, demand is down, and getting everything on the electrical grid.
Yeah, I mean, why aren't these politicians listening? Economists, scientists, people that know their stuff are telling these politicians that these new ideas are not good ones. There's a reason why we banned fracking and all the rest of it. Why aren't they listening?
I think, so we released a report earlier this year on lobbying called The Power of Big Finance. And it basically looked at the oversized influence that the banking sector has on politicians. So we found that, throughout 2020 and 2021, MPs and political parties received over £17 million from banks and their lobbyists. Over a third of Treasury meetings were with just this one sector, the banking sector. And, financial firms that hired a former Chancellor saw an uptake of 59% in their meetings with the Treasury. They have this huge influence over politics. Over a fifth of peers in the House of Lords have also got jobs in the financial sector, including over half of those who sit on the committee in the House of Lords that's supposed to regulate the financial sector, supposed to scrutinise the financial sector. So they have this huge influence over our politicians, over our democracy, and essentially banks want what's profitable. So if something's good for the banks, that's what politicians are going with because they're following the money. And we really need to undo that We need much stronger transparency, much stricter rules on lobbying and spending and what can be donations to MPs and political parties. It all needs to be stripped back. It needs to be much smaller, so that the ordinary people who the politicians are supposed to be working for, who they're elected to work for and who they're paid to work for, are the people they're actually working for.
Yeah, so why aren't they listening? You know, we're the people that are voting them into power. You know, surely our voting power has got to be more powerful than these individual lobbyists. What's going on there? Is democracy completely broken?
I was going to say one of the things we called for in that report is a ban on second jobs, because if you have a second job in another sector and that one's paying a lot more, then obviously they're working for that sector more than they're working for the public. So we called for an outright ban on second jobs. I think with regards to democracy, I don't think it's broken, but I think faith in it is at an all-time low. Polling from Carnegie UK at the start of this year found that less than half of the English public feel that democracy works well in the UK. And an overwhelming majority, around 3/4, don't trust MPs, don't trust the government to make decisions that will improve their lives. And as I say, I think the reason the needs of so many are overlooked is that, you know, we have sectors like the financial sector, also other sectors like oil and gas, who have disproportionate influence over public policymakers, not just in government, but in, you know, the Bank of England, who also set rules. We found that over a third of all their policymakers historically, over 3/4 even, have worked in private finance. A couple of the sitting members of policymaking committees there still work in private finance, still have second jobs in that. And they're setting the rules for private finance while also being employed by or receiving share payments from private finance. So that's what really needs to be undone.
Yeah, gosh, so much interesting stuff. Thank you. This is really, really interesting. So I'm going to move on now to climate and the impact climate-related risk has or potentially has on our economy. I wonder if you could just explain what the Bank of England climate stress tests were and whether we should be worried about the results of those.
Yeah, so the climate stress tests, essentially the Bank of England ran through their modelling software 3 scenarios. One where UK banks respond swiftly to climate breakdown. One where they respond but slowly with a delayed response. And one where they don't respond at all. And they basically found that British banks could stand to lose hundreds of billions of pounds if they failed to act promptly, which could obviously sow the seeds of another financial crisis, as well as accelerating climate breakdown. But I think what we really need to see from the Bank of England is moving beyond these data gathering exercises and moving towards genuine action. Or if you are going to be, you know, gathering data, the technical name for it is double materiality. But basically this idea is that as well as measuring the impacts of, you know, climate on banks, you measure the impact that banks are having on the climate, so that you can appropriately act and, you know, negate that risk. And this is something we'll be talking about our research team will be talking about in the updated release of our Green Central Banking Scorecard, which is coming out in November. Basically where we rank the G20 banks based on their climate policies, and see, you know, who's leading the pack there and who's lagging behind. So, yeah.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. Because I know the European Central Bank has been making some progressive moves on climate. Can you talk about some of the things that the ECB is doing just to compare it to the Bank of England and what they're not doing?
Yeah, I mean, there was news from the ECB just the other day that firms could be sued if they're not, following climate rules. But they've also recently said that they're going to shift to sort of only investing in companies that have strong climate policies, that have, strong disclosure, transition plans, and that there will be penalisation for firms that are greenwashing or that don't stick to those plans. And that's just not something we're seeing from the Bank of England at the moment.
So can you talk about, maybe give us a few sort of specific policies that you would love to see Liz Truss and gang introduce to create a better, fairer, greener economy?
So I think one thing we would, well, in an ideal world, instead of, capping energy prices at £2,500, which is still way more expensive than they were at the start of the year, we would pull it back to pre-April levels. I don't think we're going to see that, but that would be, an ideal policy. Most of them will be not doing things that they've said they're going to do. So not lifting the ban on fracking, not scrapping the cap on bankers' bonuses, because, it's already double their salary that they can make in bonuses. Banks were already set to pay out $4 billion in bonuses this year. They paid out $2.6 billion in bonuses last year. So these aren't the people that need your help right now. And doing it under the guise of, competitiveness and wanting to attract talent to the City of London. Well, there hasn't been a huge exodus of bankers post-Brexit, which we were told there would be, but that hasn't happened. So I don't think we need to focus on making the city more attractive right now for workers in that sector. We also don't want so basically Liz Truss is talking about reversing the increased corporation tax that Rishi Sunak announced last year. So last year Sunak cut taxes that banks would have to pay, and he basically justified this by saying, well, corporation tax is going up, so they'll have to pay more that way. And now Liz Truss is going back on that and saying, actually, we're not going to increase corporation tax. So banks just got a huge tax cut last year that's completely unjustifiable. So that really won't help anyone except them. And we also think that, this idea, Liz Truss wants to merge 3 key city watchdogs. She's floated that idea. And these watchdogs were set up after the financial crisis. The financial services sector was split up, so there were more regulators, and she wants to merge them all back together again, which is just rewinding to post-crash rules and undoing things we did after the crash to make the system more secure. So yeah, the policies we want to see are mostly things we don't want them to do. But in terms of what we do want them to do, New Economics Foundation and Fuel Poverty Action have floated this idea of free basic energy. So everyone gets a free amount covered by the government to do the basics, to turn the oven on, to heat their house. But beyond that, costs would become more expensive. So for people heating enormous houses or using more and more energy, you have a scaling cost where it gets more and more expensive for everything that gets used beyond the essentials. And that's something they're both campaigning for at the moment. So yeah, that's something we'd love to see. And also rent controls and eviction bans. Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about those rent controls and eviction bans and why that's something that you're interested in?
Yeah, we did a housing report. We did a housing report earlier this year. We published one. And essentially, if you look at the rent controls that countries in Europe have, they're so much stronger than here. And there's something we used to have, pre-Thatcher. That report basically looks at the housing affordability crisis in the UK and says that actually what we're often told is the reason people can't get on the property ladder is because there aren't enough properties. It's a supply problem. We're not building enough. And actually the problem is that during, Thatcher's premiership, she introduced all these rules which turned homes into financial assets. So it became profitable to own multiple homes, and that's sort of been encouraged. And actually, now it's so common for people to own multiple homes that's the reason people can't get on the property ladder. There's an explosion in the private rental sector. It's now enormous in the UK. I live in Brighton, where it makes up about 25% of all housing is private rentals. So after, Right to Buy, introduced by Thatcher, lots of those homes actually got turned into private rentals, who were charging much more than the council was charging before that. So it actually made things worse for a lot of people, while making things better for some people, obviously, who did achieve home ownership that way. It became sort of a financial vessel rather than a home. And, she scrapped rent controls and things like that. So those are things that really need to be brought back. And Sir Bob Kerslake yesterday basically said that, we're going to have a homelessness crisis in the UK if the eviction ban that the government put in place during the pandemic is not reintroduced, because so many people can't afford their rent right now, and are going to be made homeless as a result.
Yeah, it's fascinating actually, because there are a lot of people, working professionals, that I have been seeing struggle to find somewhere affordable to rent in London so that they can get to and from their workplace and, stay in the city where they live, or whatever the reason is. But there have been people that have been seriously worried about homelessness, who don't have family locally to them. Parents might live somewhere else in the country or abroad, and people are needing to sleep on friends' sofas. I have just never seen anything like that. So it feels like it has got so much worse. And, even for people that might be earning above an average wage, which is shocking to me. So what kind of controls are we talking about here? Would it be sort of caps on rent, or limiting how many homes that you can buy, so that, you're not buying everything up and then renting it out at extortionate prices?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think even lots of people claiming universal credit at the moment are in employment, and they're just needing that to top up what they're getting paid, because wages have stagnated so much and not kept up with inflation so much that people are really struggling right now with regards to housing and finding somewhere safe and secure to live, and affordable, most of all. So I think rent control, yes, would be talking about sort of capping what landlords can charge for, a certain amount of space. But also with regards to sort of multiple home ownership, some things we've been seeing in sort of popular holiday destinations around the UK prevent new builds from being bought up by people who already own property. So those are only allowed to be bought by people who are first-time buyers, which is obviously a really strong idea. And, as well as rentals, we're also seeing like a boom in Airbnbs, people buying second properties to let out as Airbnbs. And essentially what that means is that, firstly, those properties are only occupied for part of the year. So they're only, helping tourism, helping the local economy for part of the year, for the holiday season. Secondly, they don't always help the local economy that much, because obviously a lot of people cook for themselves when they're in an Airbnb. So they're not necessarily eating out at local restaurants. They're often buying from the local chain supermarket. And thirdly, it obviously just stops people who actually live in that area, who've grown up in that area, being able to buy those properties, because they're going to people who are only there for 2 or 3 months out of the year. So that's a really strong policy that could be rolled out more widely.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. This is so great, Chloe. I can't even tell you how fantastic all this is. Thank you. So there's lots going on, and a lot of it is quite worrying, because we were already in a situation where people were struggling. The pandemic made even more people struggle. and the wealth gap was already huge, and yet there are these new policies that, due to our new government, that are being sort of spoken about, which we just know, and the experts know, are going to make things a lot worse for the less well off. What does anything make you optimistic about the future? Are we going to be okay?
Do you know what? There are actually quite a few things that have made me optimistic about the future, especially over the summer, hot strike summer. That was great, seeing a surge in unions for the first time in decades, really, like enormous strikes, seeing people mobilize and like recognize their collective power, and basically demand deserved wage increases. There was a whole discourse about, people being greedy because they were asking for a single digit increase in their wages. When actually we've seen that in the financial services sector, I know I keep going on about the financial services sector, but they were seeing over 30% increases in their wages during from the start of the pandemic to I think it was the start of this year, while everyone else saw a 14% increase on average. So in real terms, it was 23% for that sector, 7% for everyone else. So it's not, it's not greedy for people in these essential services to be asking for more. And especially with inflation where it is, to be asking, they deserve more. So that was like really positive. That made me feel really good. We have a good blog out on that. 2 of my colleagues joined the strikes, the train strikes. So yeah, that's something that's given me a lot of hope. I think growing numbers recognizing the power of their collective voices through campaigns like Enough is Enough, Don't Pay UK, Warm This Winter, has also been, I think really, really positive. And I think we'll actually see, we are actually seeing politicians having to take notice because of the enormous numbers of people that are joining these campaigns. And actually there was a British attitude survey released yesterday, which showed that most people agree with, quote unquote, woke positions on issues like racial inequality, immigration, sexual identity. So actually, lots of people do want a better society. Lots of people do care about the other people in their community. And this sort of, the flames of this so-called culture war are being stoked by the media. And that's not actually representative of how most people in this country feel. Most people in this country do care and they do want better, and they aren't happy with the way things are right now. So yeah, basically just people learning to use their collective voice and realizing they have strength in numbers and that there's power in numbers.
Yeah. So just thinking about what people can do now. So they've heard you talk about the issues and some of the solutions. What makes you feel optimistic? What can ordinary people do? Are there any actions they can take to support some of the changes that you've been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would do is I signed the Fuel Poverty Action petition on free basic energy. It's called Energy for All. I think that's a great idea. And, lots of people have been talking about the cost of Liz Truss's freezing the energy price cap. Well, actually, we could be doing something like this instead, which would have a cost, but also you'd be making money from those scaling energy costs for people using lots more than the essential amount of energy. There are lots of organisations like Make My Money Matter who also, give people advice on what they can do about their pension funds. There are others that talk about bank accounts too, and basically how your pension fund and your bank are spending your money without your knowledge and what you can do about that. So, writing to them, writing to your MP, actually threatening to change providers. So that's always something positive to look into. And then the third thing I would say is just join a union. I'm part of my local renters union and they do really great work in the area. They've stopped a lot of illegal evictions during COVID and they're stopping a lot of forced evictions now. So yeah, join a union.
Great. I love those tips. Um, so working on these types of topics, it's such a huge job, and it's stressful and it's hard, and it can leave us feeling downbeat. So a question that I have been asking everyone that I speak to is what are the kind of activities or habits that you have that remind you or reconnect you with what is good about the world right now?
Yeah, so I one of the things I do for work is I put out like news roundups in the morning for the whole team. And something I've started doing recently is including, like a positive news section, which makes me feel good because, after reading all the negative news, it's nice to have like a positive at the end. And other team members have said that it makes them feel good too. So that's something I like to do. And you can actively seek out that, I follow accounts on social media like Good News Network and Positive News that put out like really uplifting stories across all kinds of things, like wildlife, nature, energy, and just like small businesses doing really important things, really ingenious things. So those are great to follow. And I also follow a lot of campaign groups on social media because it's great to be reminded that there are people out there fighting for change, and doing good work. And when those groups post their wins, it does make you feel like change is possible.
Nice. Can you share one of the most heartwarming good news stories that you've read recently so we can kind of end on that note?
Okay, let me find one. I'll look in my digests and I'll pick my favourite one.
Okay.
Yeah, the last few days they've all been... I guess Patagonia's owner giving away the company so that all the billions of profits will go to the climate crisis was really great news. That was really nice. It is also important to recognise that we shouldn't rely on the generosity of billionaires, and we do need the public sector and governments to be doing more. But yeah, it was still really great news. So basically, yeah, the owner of Patagonia has given away the company so that all the profits of that company will go towards, helping causes that fight the climate crisis. I think it's a Chilean company, or Argentinian. That's the region, isn't it, Patagonia, which has been particularly hit by the climate crisis because they have sort of melting glaciers right at the tip, and declining, penguin populations and things like that. So it is an area that has been particularly affected by it. So yeah, I think that was a great move. That was really positive. That is billions of pounds going towards the cause. Yeah, I don't really know the specifics of the giveaway.
That's okay.
But yeah.
Right. And you were going to say something about China.
Yeah, so The Guardian wrote an article on reasons to be cautiously optimistic about the climate, which included falling emissions in China, which is obviously the world's biggest polluter, which was great news. What I mentioned earlier, the report from the International Energy Agency, which said that globally, more people are now employed in clean energy than the fossil fuel industry, which was great news. And so, yeah, there is lots of positive news out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. I mean, all of the different issues you're covering are just so incredibly important, and it's just great to know that there's people out there working on it and trying to make a difference and coming up with realistic solutions to many of our problems. So thank you. Thanks so much for spending the time with me.
Thanks so much for having me.